Yes, it's the hollow core fibre.
It's a what?
Hollow core fibre. So it turns out that the speed of light in glass is
Yeah, it's 0.7 and 0.65 or something.
yeah, somewhere in the 60s. Yeah, yeah. Which is important if you're doing high frequency trading between you.
So I mean, there's somebody who's basically built a microwave thing from New York to Chicago by buying like one kilobyte of these square things and putting microwave towers. Because that's but there's way more like RF to electrical RF conversions. But because you have like so like but because you gain that back, it's the light will still go like the microsecond. Some number.
The amount of money people will spend for a microsecond. Oh.
A friend of mine works for a company. They have systems. They're the ones who actually get the trades directly from NASDAQ, and then they distribute them to the actual agency traders. And there's labor. They now have fiber. The exchanges, like cases of exchanges, but everybody has the same length of fiber from them to the.
No, it doesn't matter where you are.
So it doesn't matter where in the room you are. And somebody managed to open one of the doors.
Yeah.
So basically, replace the long piece of fiber for a piece of fiber. And like pages or like microservices. There's also a lot of these algorithms. Or now they're working for nets that have FPGAs so that you can actually do bill trading on the net.
So it doesn't have to transfer all the way.
Yes, you don't need to go to the PCI buttons, etc.
So you're putting trade logic on network cards? Yes.
Yeah. Because you don't get up, you have to put it on like PCI buttons, it will use it.
And there's all the schedules in place and the guess what time it is?
CAPPORT time. It's CAPPORT time. All right, if you're not here for captive portals, stay anyway because the room's kind of empty. So,
We want to give our impressions.
yeah, right. That's sad. I saw Rick on the way out, and he's not here. He must have something else on. Never mind. So, apologies from Eric, my co-chair, who is dealing with family medical emergencies. I don't see him online, so we'll just have to do this without him. If there's anything we need to decide concretely, we'll take it to the list anyway, so that's not a big problem. Right, well, forms. We have to do this at some point during the presentation, which reminds people of their IPR obligations. And
a lot of other important new stuff.
And a lot. This is very, very new, and somewhat mangled. But you get the drift. Adam's still reading. I'm sorry, Adam. But this... All right, everyone's seen that. This is the old one. Damn. Never mind.
How is it different?
I have the means. Oh, of course, the slides didn't update. The agenda has, though. Stupid. All right. So we've had a request from Darshak to talk about some of the hotspot light security properties. We'll do that if we have time. Depends on how we go on the meaty issues that we have in front of us. Does anyone have any agenda bash? No? Great. Next. Very brief status. Other working groups do this. So just to remind people, we have two drafts. They're adopted. One of them was even updated this week. Thanks, Kyle. You missed the cutoff by, I think, seconds. If it was an hour. Yeah. But that should be all updated. These are on GitHub as well, so you can see the latest version right there. That's for later. The agenda says that I think Tommy's going to talk right now.
hold this. Hello, I'm Tommy. So this is on behalf of both Darshak and myself. So we do have a working group draft version of the Captive Portal API now, as Martin mentioned. It is up on GitHub. It is also on the main document. So this is taken from the one that had been started before and cleaned up with some of the feedback from the group, and it is still very much a work in progress with open issues, but this is what we have. So what we want to go over is what we've put in there so far. It's pretty basic, and what are the open issues and how we want to see it evolve from there. Next slide, please. Great. So it's a pretty basic API we have here. We define first that we have some URI that we get by some other means that is not part of this document. And this URI specifies some resource that is accessible using HTTP over TLS. And this resource is a JSON dictionary, which is fetched from this API server. Presently, it is with a GET request. And the JSON keys at the most basic form define whether or not you are currently allowed to get through the captive portal. Permitted, it's a Boolean. A HMAC key, which we are going to, I hope, discuss a little bit more, which allows us to hopefully authenticate other items in the captive portal interaction. It has the user portal URL, which defines, here's the user-facing website which you can go to actually do your normal interaction. It may be the same server as what you have, it may be a different one. The expire date, which is an optional field, our best guess of when this captive portal will close on you. And the bytes remaining, which is essentially the byte-driven rather than time-driven form of the same thing as the last, of when you're going to get captivated. So that's essentially what it has right now. Fairly straightforward, just kind of the minimum set of things we think the API needs to have. Next slide, please. All right, so there are several open issues on the GitHub. So I just thought I'd cover them here, and maybe as we're going through them, if people want to comment on them, please come up to the mic, because then we can kind of just gnaw on them. And if you have more thoughts, please do go to the GitHub and write your thoughts and comments on the issues there. So first one, privacy. I think Martin brought this one up. So we want to make sure that the per-client information, such as the HMAC key, if this is unique, is not being stored in shared caches if we have some proxying and stuff going on. And so the document should specify that responses should include cache control private to say, don't just cache this JSON information everywhere. Do people think this is the right way to do it? I think it sounds fine. Any objections? Are we good for this? Are there other things that we should do to specify privacy around this API information here? Sounds good?
To be clear, this is confidentiality. The privacy risk here would be related to the captive portal harvesting user information or something along those lines, which I don't think we're particularly worried about. I mean, yes, we might worry about that at some point, but I'm not sure there's anything we can do about it. So I think this is fine.
Yep, great, cool. Thank you. That's a good clarification. All right, we will do that. Next issue. Okay, so discussing the HMAC key. So currently, the API document refers to this. It is admittedly underspecified as of right now because it essentially needs to refer to something in the architecture document to say, what is this being used for? How is this being used between the various things? Last time at the last meeting, we were talking about this key as a token for validating ICMP messages, such that ICMP messages could use this key in some manner to sign that, hey, I came from someone who has the same authority as the API server that you first opened with. So what are people's thoughts on which document should be defining this? Does this belong in the architecture document? Are we going to have another document that talks about ICMP for blocking that uses this key? What do you think, Kyle?
Well, Kyle Rose, I mean, we're not sure yet if you're even going to have ICMP, and if that's the case, do we still need the HMAC key?
Potentially not.
Okay, but I mean, supposing we do go with ICMP, I'm not sure that the API should be specifically, sorry, the architecture document should be talking about the specifics of the API. I think it should still be general, talking about a token. And then maybe the ICMP draft, presumably, and the API draft would both say, this is the token by which we communicate. I guess the only concern there is now we have these two documents that are using the same thing that aren't necessarily tied together externally.
Right. I could imagine if you want to, in the architecture document, define very strongly, there is a notion of a token that can be given from the captive portal enforcement cluster to the UE to validate future communications, which may be ICMP, which may be other things that come up down the line, but you don't say how we get it or how it's used. API says, hey, this is how you get it, and an ICMP document says, this is how it's used.
So we probably talk about the requirements on that token, essentially.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. I would like that to have something to refer to in your document. Do you have thoughts, Martin?
Yeah, so this is not chair hat stuff.
Yeah.
There's a number of ways we can cut this particular one because it sort of crosses a couple of documents. One option would be to, if we were to decide to do ICMP, do that in an ICMP specific document and define an extension to this document that did that. That means we get this document out of the critical path on that decision. But I'm not necessarily sure that's really going to help us long term because we have the architecture thing that needs to address the core question of whether it exists or not. So I think probably what we need is that decision, and then that will make all things clear.
The decision about
ICMP,
yes.
Yeah, great. And that's on the agenda for later today. So we should.
Okay. So essentially, based on that, something will change in the API document to reflect our decision later today.
Likewise with the architecture.
Great.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot my badge. I wonder if that discussion is just not one of the reasons why, I mean, maybe that's a hint that an ICMP-based solution is a bit complicated because it requires communication between different elements like the API, the captive portal API server and some routers, devices that are going to send those ICMP messages. So that's probably for later, but I wanted to say it now because we have the discussion now about the complexity of the standardization of that solution. Maybe that's a hint that the technical solution using that would be actually complex as well.
That's fair. In the case of using ICMP in the most basic sense of just saying, hey, you were blocked, I see that as a useful piece of architecture, and anything that's doing that should be validated. I could imagine we could end up going some other way than ICMP, but as long as we have some interaction that's not directly coming from this client-initiated connection to an API server, that we want to essentially have some other out-of-band channel for saying, oh, you did something wrong, anything wouldn't probably need to be validated. And so we could find other uses for this too, potentially. So anyway, we'll have that discussion later. Next slide, please. All right, server authentication. So the API document does not currently, but needs to describe the server authentication model. And specifically, it was brought up that CRLs and OCSP will generally fail if you're captive, unless those things are explicitly whitelisted. This could get a little bit complicated, but we really do want to do HTTPS. So it was brought up that OCSP stapling does avoid the issue because it essentially puts the burden on the server to get the OCSP credentials and pass them through. That seems to be pretty clean to me as a way of validating this authentication. So I think the option here would be make OCSP stapling mandatory as part of this. That sounds fine to me. One question is, what do we do if that stapling is not present? Do we reject the portal altogether? Do we throw up an error? What happens when we cannot validate the server? Do we have thoughts?
That's an excellent question. Ryan, thanks for coming.
Hey, Ryan Sleevey, Google. So
And I was looking over this, wondering the same question. One potential implication of this is going to be figuring out intermediates. And, obviously TLS-1.3 has the ability to staple intermediates, but client path building is going to be non-deterministic based on their trust anchors. So even if you had a stapled set of intermediates, you're going to have this set of problems. Regardless. And the other part is going to figure out what is the client going to do? Like, does it actually care about the OCSP side for the validation? And as we know, clients don't matter. I hesitate to say that OCSP stapling is a must for that reason, right? You're going to have client behavior who's going to have alternative mechanisms, both for intermediates and for leaf certs. Alternatively, guidance, the fact that if you want to look at a client profile, then supporting, and I forget the RC, the lightweight OCSP profile, namely the GET method, would allow these captive portals to distinguish OCSP from the other set of requests and could potentially allow anything conforming to the lightweight profile through. And so rather than trying to force the OCSP stapling, say like, here's how you can identify OCSP request responses and potentially allow them through on a captive portal in the same way that certain other traffic. And that's, from looking at some of the captive portals that we've seen in the real world, that is something that has fairly commonly come up. Most commonly, like semantics, OCSP responders are whitelisted in captive portals for that exact reason of the sign-up page needs to get through.
So essentially, would we end up saying in the text maybe something like, you should do OCSP stapling when you can because it's nice and more efficient, and then you should also whitelist?
Yeah, I think because of these aspects of client behavior non-determinism, because of the trust anchor issue, then providing guidance is probably going to be the best option. OCSP stapling, absolutely, like choice for getting that server configuration, but the intermediate problem won't go away even with TLS-1.3.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Mark Donnelly, Painless Security. Looking at it in the real world, I love the idea of the OSCP stapling. As for whether it should be mandatory,
Typos in the slide.
OCSP, yeah, it's. I love the idea of the stapling. As far as making it mandatory, looking at the real world, I can't imagine that implementers will agree to make it mandatory.
So like a should of, this is a nice idea, but you're probably not going to do it.
And possibly even if you want to make something mandatory, you might mandate that implementers, if they choose to ignore the stapling, must present the user a message, something like that.
Right, so I guess, what are your thoughts then if we cannot validate the server authentication?
Pardon me?
Well, so what do you have an opinion on what the UE should do if we fail to validate the server? We just drop from the network? Do we prompt the user, do you want to trust this invalid certificate?
The API doesn't work, therefore it doesn't exist, and you fall back to the crappy behavior.
So we essentially say, if this doesn't work, this entire feature does not exist.
Right. I think. Sorry.
Yeah. Try again.
But one of the things that might happen in that case is there's a misconfiguration somewhere, and there's any number of misconfigurations that are possible in this context, and one of them might be that you are actually hitting the captive portal that's trying to intercept your communications, and that suggests that you need to go probing again at that point. Yep.
I think that there's two different issues there, and I think you started to get to them, which are, what do we do if we can't validate the certificate at all? And what do we do if we think validate the certificate and find that it's invalid? And I'm not sure whether we should behave the same way in those two cases or not. There's also the question, given the number of sites that have invalid certificates or are not signed by a full certificate authority but are self-signed or other things like that, I don't know. One of the goals of the security, I think, here is to make it no worse than it is now. But I also think that one of the goals of the service in this case should be that by inserting this, we make it no worse than it is now. And so why you wouldn't try that URL and just try to log in like we do now if there's no validate. I'm not even sure why we're trying to validate the certificate on some level, because right now, people aren't, and they get logged in. And if this gets in the way of people getting logged in, who would have been able to get logged in otherwise, it's not going to be very popular.
I think we can distinguish here between the site that people, essentially users directly interact with, and this other channel, which is more of a system level communication to get the JSON. If we essentially fall back and we imagine that for some time being, captive portals still deploy the old I redirect you model, we essentially just go down that route and ignore everything that's in the API, right? So we allow you to do what you do today, but we don't take into account anything that may have been inside the JSON that would say, oh, here's your expire time, here's this, here's that. Essentially, that is not trusted. We just fall back to the dumb model.
Right, I mean, that works for me, is that this stuff is supposed to be secured.
Right.
But we don't want to make any of the stuff that previously worked stop working.
Right, but if we can essentially end up in the future using the API JSON to bootstrap devices that don't have browsers on them, enable new use cases, those cases don't work today. And so we don't have to get the goodness if we can't validate beyond what we have today.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Kyle Rose, what about, I mean, one service this could provide is some, just confidence that your captive portal was not out to get you, or at least a bit more confidence.
It is out to get you.
They are what they say they are, doesn't mean they're not up to date.
Fair enough. But is it worth warning when these things happen at least? I mean, it was brought up, but should we recommend that the user equipment manufacturers, rather than just doing the same thing regardless of whether or not it's secure or insecure, actually say, hey, this thing failed to validate. You can use it if you want, but
that gets into a very UI system specific area. I could imagine one way that it falls out is that if people are using a validated method of discovering their captive portal, that maybe rather than shaming the ones that are using the legacy system, we just kind of add the little green check mark, or like, hey, we have a secure lock on this new portal, which we didn't have previously.
Aren't we about to start shaming people who don't use HTTPS?
Right. I mean, I think it should follow whatever mechanisms are standard for that system or that browser.
Darshak Thakur, Cable Labs. So one reason for kind of trying to authenticate, right, is to at least give an indication of saying that there might be a man-in-the-middle kind of attack, right? If somebody is actually trying to do snooping or something, then you still tell the user saying you are connected to just like how you get a notification right now, you are connected to an open network. Anybody can look at you, right? And the same message might pop up in this case.
All right, very good. Thank you for the discussion, everyone. I think we can move on to the next issue. Thank you, Martin. All right, media type. It was brought up that rather than just requesting application JSON, we should have a specific media type to allow better versioning. That sounds like a neat idea. I like it. First, does everyone think that's a good idea? And then second, what is this media type? What should we define it as?
Bike shed warning. You pick.
Okay, great.
If we
The
decide to
editors
do
will
it.
pick something, and if you don't like it, you can.
So we should discuss whether we want one or not.
Okay, yes. Do we want
but
one first?
When it comes to the decision about what it is, please choose. Don't make us discuss it here.
Great.
Yeah, I'm young and naive or something, and could you just explain quickly how this supports better versioning?
I think, Martin, did you bring this one up initially?
Pass. So one of the standard problems that we have with these sorts of APIs is that you go to them and it has a particular format and you develop expectations about those sorts of things. You can, with HTTP, use content negotiation to get different media types. So we pick the first one on this list right now, and later on we have a change of mind and want to make a backwardly incompatible change to the format. We could pick the second one, and clients that support the old one would send nothing or would send except the first one, and clients that accept the new one would send the accept header with the second one in it, and the server could use that information to provide the new one, and you can then seamlessly transition from one to the other.
Okay, so like, I mean, we probably wouldn't change it from captive to CAPPORT. We might, but it might be that captive null is the current version and captive 1 or 2 or X or Y is
I
the
mean,
next version. Is that the idea?
Yes, that's the idea.
Optimistically and just call it captive.
And
And then if we, we could come up with a secondary name.
No.
Right. Leave off the version number in hopes. Exactly.
Right.
Precisely.
Yeah. Taro's idea is JSON 2, which is brings all sorts of horrible images into my mind.
Oh, whatever we have in 5 years or 2 years. sorry.
Yeah, the JSON 2, yeah.
SQL, sure.
There you go.
How people see that.
Anyway, so I do find this approach compelling. So I think we'll add it into the next version. All right, next slide. Okay, I'm just going to follow up to a discussion that we had on the list. One of the non-published versions of this was playing with doing like a well-known inside the URI. That was discussed to be an inappropriate use of well-known. But I just wanted to discuss here with the group the approach that we have of essentially making sure that we're getting the right resource from this URI. There's various suggestions made about link relations, specifying also that the UE could first issue just a head request to figure out what's there. I would like to, in the API document, be a little bit more clear about how we're going to use this URI and exactly what the contract is for when we're fetching the API and when we're not. We could just say, I accept content of application captive JSON and say that's the way to do it. But I do think we should be more explicit than we are today. So what are our thoughts on that? I don't have a particularly strong opinion here.
Pierre Fisser. My first thought, I didn't see the discussion on the mailing list, but my first thought would be that what the situation we are trying to get away from is having to send probes. And if you use something like .wellknown./JSON API, maybe you will open the door to use probes again. So I would say that it's better if you must have a way to discover deterministically the captive API. And so that captive API can be using any URI. So you cannot just guess it.
Right, that's very true. So we either get it from DHCP, RA, PVD, RAs, So we receive this information, we have the URI. There is a question of, like we had in the original version of the API document, this URI could be the same or very similar to the one that's actually the user-facing landing page. Potentially, they're only differentiated by the type of content I'm requesting. Maybe they're totally different. It's essentially that relationship that needs to be very clearly specified. And so
I think that's fine. Yeah.
Okay.
All right. So I'm not leaving this chair, but I do have a question.
Yeah.
We have 7710. We're going to talk about that in a little bit.
Yes.
That only produces one URL.
That's correct.
Are we going to mandate the use of this new media type to distinguish between clients that support the API and clients that are ignorantly hitting this URL? Or are we going to say that URL in 7710 points to this?
That's essentially the question, right? So if we do a get to the 7710 equivalent or the thing from PVD or whatever, is that always, like if I don't include any content type, is that the API? And it just tells me, hey, I'm application captive JSON. Or do I specifically have to ask for captive JSON? Is the question.
Okay, Dr. Thakur. So my opinion on this one is maybe what we should do is that if we can say that if the 7710 URI is an HTML, then we can just put a should or a recommendation saying, if you are going to serve point to the HTML page, then in that, if I do a get on that, maybe we use the link relation in there to point to the captive portal. If you, then that way, it's up to them to, in terms of deployment, to decide whether they want to point to the captive portal or the HTML. And maybe we can do the reverse. We can even allow for saying, we already have the URI for the HTML page, right? So we already covered. Yeah. So, but if we can allow the HTML guys to say, okay, just add a link relation to the captive portal, then that might solve the problem.
And Pierre Fister again, as one of the PVD draft authors. So for information, if you discover those URIs from the PVD object, we can just have two keys, one for one for the other, that are separate, very clear, and you can have one or the other or both or either.
Yeah, so to be clear, this is not a problem for PVDs where we have essentially the ability to provide two URLs when there are two things. The question here is which one, and Darshak's suggesting pick, which was not an option I had considered. What do people think about that?
I mean, I'd like to think more about that. Maybe if you could write up a pull request for how that would look in the text, that would be interesting to see.
Not much as individual. So I must have missed something. Martin, can you highlight what you think the difference is between that and what you proposed in the list earlier? 'Cause it sounded pretty much the same approach.
So there are a number of options that we have here. One of which is the URL points canonically to the user interface page that exists, and you would use a link relation to point from that to the API document.
Right.
The next option is that this always points to the API document.
Okay. So there's
And we already have
things.
we have a link in here already, so that's fine. We can follow that link. And now Darshak has suggested a third option, which is you choose and we'll work it out. Yes, that's the face that I would make if
We as
I
the
weren't
client?
share.
Like the client just sort of figures out what
The GUI
happened.
when it arrives in the network, it sees this URL, it just makes a request to it and
Sees what
works out
happens.
what it gets.
Okay.
It's certainly possible, technically possible, but I'm not sure that that's necessarily
So the
the best.
recommendation, what we should say is that if you're going to serve an HTML, then at least have a link relation being sent in the response.
Yeah,
So
that would be necessary,
Yeah,
yes.
that would be necessary.
So essentially use a link relation if that's how you want to set it up. But if you just deliver us directly a
API,
application captive JSON, then we already know we have what we need and we just use that instead.
Okay, I see that.
So they essentially make the client resilient to multiple deployment models.
Right, but it basically means that the original 7710 deployment model is gone. Because if something shows up, does that query and tries to render it to a user, then you might just get a blob of JSON and.
Right. I mean, this is kind of based on the assumption that we haven't actually seen deployment of that and we haven't seen any UEs actually adopt anything that deals with that.
Right, so if there's anyone that has actually used 7710
Yes,
in anger,
So to
then
put a
we
finer
have to
point
do
on
the
it,
first one.
if we're going to decide that 7710 just never happened and we're going to like diss it and say it's now always this, then there's no point in using any negotiation at all. There's one URI, it's the API. No one's ever going to use it for human rendering text.
That would also be very clean. And so I guess that kind of transitions into our other discussion. I think this is my last slide.
I think this is your last one? No?
Is it not?
Um,
Yes. End of the road.
According to this, there's a blank slide after that.
Yes, great. Okay, so I think that covers the open issues. We will be updating the document for next time. Please raise more issues or write pull requests if you would like. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Tommy. Right, so the next question that we have, and thanks for those people who responded on the list on this one already, is what to do with 7710. There was a nice long list of issues. I'm going to bring them up just here. So, look at that. That's the discussion we just had. There's a big question. So, number one question, what does the URI point to? Darshak presented option 3. Then there was the intent to signal explicitly that there's no captive portal. So, so I think this one's, I can't remember where this idea came from, but it might be nice to have some sort of explicit signal to say, hey, this network is not captive. Don't bother going off talking to an API or anything like that. But that would be particularly useful in the case where we made the assumption that this points to HTML rather than the API, because then you have fewer steps in the whole process. Part of what we're trying to address here is the amount of time that it takes to actually get a network up when you connect to it. So that would be helpful there. The third one's an interesting one. 7710 has a requirement for the URL to contain an address literal. This is one paragraph. Just, do this. And it turns out that runs counter to the discussion we had previously about actually authenticating things. So we'd remove that. And there might be some other things, but I'm not aware of anything. It's actually a pretty short document, and it's pretty hard to find faults in a document that's that short. But we found this many. Anyone want to? So basically, the question here primarily is: do we want to take on the work? And who wants to take on that work? Speak. So Warren, we have 2 of the authors. I think we might have more. No.
How many were there?
There were 4 of them.
Oh my God. So yeah, Warren Kumari, sorry, one of the original authors of this. So on the list, I said that I thought 2 was a bad idea. And then somebody replied, and it now seems like a good idea, but I forgot to mention that. So yeah, whoever I said that's a bad idea to, I'm sorry. And then for number 3, I think that the address literal requirements was one of those things that was put in because we kind of had to, with the assumption that nobody would ever do it. It was one of those, yep, I know. Yeah, somebody asked for it, but we didn't think it would actually, in the real world, be used that way. Yeah, I know.
They said they couldn't do anything else.
Yeah, somebody said they couldn't do anything else, but, so we stuck it in with the assumption that most sane people would put in non-address literal URLs. So, yeah, I'm sorry, it all sucks.
That's all right. We can change that.
And if anybody wants to update it, great. I'm also happy to help update it. Or, that many issues in one document, I'm fine if you say no, don't touch it.
So what we might actually do in that case is enlist you as a co-author or something like that, but find someone to actually hold the pen, since I understand that you're somewhat busy. Yeah.
Say it.
Pierre Fistel again, as a PVD draft author again, obviously trying to push my stuff. I just wanted to understand if there is, if it's either that or the PVD, or is there any scenario where both are in the question? My question is as well, so the PVD option now has an option number. It's showing good progress. Do you want to go that way or try to piggyback what we are doing, which seems for me at least to have a good traction and could be honestly, the captive portal is a wonderful use case for PVD stuff. So open, I would like to understand how those 2 options work together or not.
That's a good question.
Hiro Takanakashima. I agree with Knor, not to have the option to, that if there is no captive portal, that nothing should be broadcasted, included in the DHCP options. And also, if we, I think like IEEE 802.11u has some kind of option that tells that I verify client that they have this network is restricted or this network is open. So we have another choice to tell that this network is no captive portal. I don't think that option 2 should be included.
So Hiro, can you send pointer to the places where that information is? You said 802 something.
11u.
You okay?
Yes, please.
Yeah.
We're not trying to target only wireless access. We're also trying to target wired access, which may not be using 802.11.
Tommy Polly, Apple. Right, just chiming in that I think we want to do something that's beyond just Wi-Fi. We want to do something that is at kind of layer 3 and up. In this case, as far as the no portal, even in the Wi-Fi case, as far as I'm aware, you can indicate that there is blocking, but there's no explicit indication that there's not. And so as a UE developer, I would really love not to have to wait on probes or wait on other requests, such that if I see a redirect, I can treat it as a misconfiguration or some attack. Regarding Pierre's point on the PVD stuff, Well, I'm thinking about 7710 because people can look at this today. I think we should update it or diss it or something, just to point people to whatever we're now thinking and how this is going to play with the overall architecture. It essentially could become the captive portal discovery draft part of the architecture. I would love to see the PVD stuff be used here. I can also see a very strong reason not to tie the fate of deploying any captive portal API to that. I could imagine that the BIS or update to this document, because we already have the option defined for 7710. So essentially just say, hey, let's reuse this option and here's what the URI means. And also we do need some document that references PVD, that extends PVD with the definition of where does that option go in that. Because I believe at the current time, we're not including any captive notion in the base PVD document. So I was thinking we could just have one document that updates this, which is like, here's how you do discovery of the captive portal thing. Here's how you interpret it when it's just directly in DHCP. And it can also be inside an RA extension called a PVD that gives you this other data. So like, here's the DHCP and RA based ways of getting this URI. And it's just kind of one story there.
So now I have to ask the question, how close are we to getting that PVD doc? Because this could be done theoretically in months, if not weeks, with basically last calls and whatnot. We could do this reasonably quickly, right?
Yeah.
We couldn't do the same if PVD was in the mix, could we?
I don't want to be too optimistic because the entire working group is notoriously slow, but we are hoping to ask for a working group last call for before or at next IETF. Yeah, Montreal.
Last call in
Yeah, we should talk, yep.
Yeah. Either way, if we did have this, then we could just have like another extension draft specifically for PVD, so. Yeah.
I have a question, like for one, and the purpose of the I'm Mariko Kobayashi, and for one, the purpose of ULI, I have a question like so should we have to, do we have to select which one, like which is the strong point, like A or B right now in this working group?
So that one we haven't answered yet, and I'd still like to get an answer to that one. I might actually ask for, I don't know, a show of hands or preferences or something. We're not going to get a hum in this room. There's not enough people. But so the question is, do we say A, do we say B, or do we say work it out for yourselves? But yes, it's a good question.
I just want to know, and so I think first we have to know about it.
So what's your preference?
My preference, like for my opinion, like I think the login, the user landing page is just the user interface, and the user equipment itself will communicate to the API server, right? So I think the API ULI as an API, it's no.
Carry on.
And also actually we quit the IoT device use case, but there are some headless IoT devices which does not have the web interfaces. So I think the user login page is not always like,
okay. Thank you. That is option A. Yep, that's option A.
Jean-Pierre, for me, it's really obvious that if the assumption of the working group is that 7710 is not deployed today and that we can do pretty much everything we want, it has to be the API. And inside this API, we can put one of the key being that was proposed, the key to the...
It's already there,
to the login page. And that just works fairly easily.
Margaret.
I don't object to A, but I think, the original before this version of the API, there had been a mechanism to allow it to be both. And I don't know if there's a desire to do that, where when you just do a get, you actually get the login page, and we were doing a set, I think it was, in order to enter into the API. And that would allow it to be both, not you figure it out yourself. So I guess I'm saying there's actually a fourth option as well.
If anyone wants to speak to the fourth option, that's reasonable. And to sort of expand on what Margaret said there, we would probably want to use content negotiation for that. People don't like using content negotiation for that sort of thing, but it is possible. Yeah.
To basically just reiterate Mariko's point, I know we aren't trying to solve the IoT, sorry, Kyle LaRose. I know we aren't trying to solve the IoT use case, but our charter does hint that we should think about it. And I wouldn't want to go out of our way right now to preclude us from doing an IoT solution in the future. So if the architecture can leave the way open without too many changes, namely by requiring that it point to the API or that there's a way to get the API directly from the URI, I think that's a good thing. So I favor A or C or D.
So to be clear, in the discussion on the mailing list, I don't know who it was that pointed this out, it might have been Adam, that if you do the point to the login page, you can still make a head request to that one as an IoT device, harvest the link relation, and then make your way across to the API. It just takes more steps and more code. And maybe we aren't doing the IoT folks very much of a service by doing so, but it's still possible.
Yeah, so Warren Kamari, I mean, I kind of think I prefer B or C or D because there are a lot of people, you could currently deploy this and point at existing captive portals, not the ones that have been upgraded. And, we have no idea if there will be APIs deployed on them. So the advantage to B, and then, you could fetch something from that points to the API, provide you some backwards compatibility. Or option E, which I don't know what it is.
Tommy, kind of opposed to your point. So I agree that if you do something like B or the other derivatives, then you definitely could essentially stay with the existing model and all you've added is a way to not probe on the initial thing. What makes me sad there is that we essentially don't get any of the other benefits that we can imagine with this, and it actually kind of harms the deployment of something that potentially, if we're talking to something that is over HTTPS that gets us, it makes it trickier to do things in the future, such as the IoT devices, right? Like, if the deployment of this really becomes people just ignoring all the other documents other than a way to find your landing page. I could see that. As regards to kind of what we had in the original API draft, what Margaret was bringing up, I think I was trying to go for a little bit simpler approach here rather than having kind of like the multi-step. It's a lot more straightforward if we just have, I just do a get, and this is the one thing that this URI means. And it is a little bit optimistic, hoping that someday we can get to a point where we don't necessarily need any user-facing web portal that we have today. And so baking this in to mean that, that login page is the thing that you get with a get, means that if in the future we don't have that page, what do you get in response to that get request? It'd be nice to kind of elide that question in the future.
I understand. I mean, it doesn't actually make there be more steps to do a set instead of a get, but it does mean that if get could eventually go away and people might go, why are they setting? But,
So, Dashak, I think as a personal preference, I think I would say I like A, but my comment is the same thing as what you mentioned earlier is we are not sure that there is no deployment of 7710, right? It's like even while we're discussing, somebody else might deploy it. So I'm not sure how we can unilaterally say it's just going to be a API when somebody, and then you're actually breaking things, right? Because the client is expecting a JSON doc and then it gets some STM and it goes blah, right? So.
Yeah, so there is an option E that your comment just suggested to me, which is essentially Margaret's idea with content negotiation. We insist that clients use the accept header field and produce the MIME type that we just talked about. But the expectation is if you don't get back what you want, then you're back into the HTML morass. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with Martin's idea because currently there is very limited deployment of the 7710. So yeah, and also we might consider the latency between the API, the captive portal and the client, because like especially in the wireless, if there is some latency, we can reduce communication between the API and the user agent, user equipment. So my opinion is B.
B. All right. So this doesn't seem to be resolving.
And I'm moving the microphone away from Adam so he can't reach me. I've got option F. So 7710 signals with a DHCP option.
Yes.
We could leave the existing stuff alone, and the new thing could have a new DHCP option code. Okay, or not.
So maybe, Darshan, maybe a variation to that, but if you're already going to build 7710, right, then just add another field in that give, okay, yeah. Oh, I thought keeping, so the other option just tells whether, so if you have the other option also, right, that will tell you, maybe that's just saying that whether it's JSON or HTML, there you go, right? So the other option. So then I get the URL from 7710, I get the other thing that tells me whether it's a JSON or an HTML. If that other thing doesn't show up, I can just assume it's an HTML page.
All right. It doesn't seem like we're going to be resolving this anytime soon.
One last crazy idea. What if the URI is, what if the URI ends with .json or .html and it tells you which way it is?
I would like you to take that comment to the HTTP working group, which is after this session, and see how that flies. All right. I don't think we're going to get a real sense of where we're at. I think we'll take this to the list and try to come to some conclusion there. I got a sense that we have roughly an even split between those people who would like to do just the API, and those people maybe a little bit concerned about maybe there is some use out there, and maybe sort of retconning this whole thing might not be a good idea. So
Adam, from the floor again, real quick, if I could. So what Warren said actually, I think, was subtly different than that, and in a very important way, which is not that there's like currently deployed stuff out there. It doesn't turn on that. It turns on whether there might be deployments of this with new DHCP, new client, old portal. And that was a combination I don't think we had considered before, and I think it actually is relevant. It's after he said that, I began mulling things over, and honestly, of the choices that have been given so far, the one that I'm in preference of now, based on that, is the content negotiation one, even though I've been really hot on the link header before that.
Okay. Yeah, I get it.
Okay. I have no strong feelings.
This gentleman here is going to solve all our problems for us.
Oh, thank you very much. Oliver Guimason from Cloudflare. When we wrote 7710 BIS, we were just throwing up a trial balloon. It's a sad that it has taken this long to get to a BIS. What I would like is, if I go as a user, go into a portal, is I have been able to tell my computer, negotiate if the policies are blah. So I don't want to see another captive portal page ever unless they want my payment or they want to steal all my information. So API is where we should be going. So let's not worry too much about existing deployment, and let's just get something useful really fast. Does that solve your problem?
Not really.
I gave you a direction.
I certainly agree with you, but yes.
So ignore.
Yes. No,
existing page if it is insisting on only using a web page.
Yeah. All right. So the last question was, does anyone want to stick their hand up for this one? Oh, Warren's already done that anyway. You can't unstick your hand. It seems like there is the potential for some more work than this would imply. which makes me a little sad. But nonetheless, so maybe what we'll do is we will resolve that question and then try to nail someone to the wall for this particular one. Does that sound right?
So maybe everybody should propose their options, and which one gets picked has to write the draft.
Well, if you want your option to win, volunteer. Sorry, that's just how the process works. But I'm not supposed to say that, am I?
Tommy, Polly, Apple. I mean, I'm happy to help work on this, whichever way we end up going. As far as schedule, I appreciate that we do want to get this done quickly because it should be short. However, especially if this is pointing to things like the API, et cetera, it does seem like it should be aligned with the other documents because it'll be a lot stronger if we can point to those. So were you thinking that this would actually come before other documents end up getting pushed?
So one of the things we've done in other working groups is call something done, working group last, call it, and park it until the other things are ready to go. And that may be what we do with this one as well. Great. Sound reasonable?
Yep.
Okay, well, thank you, everyone. That was most helpful. I'll go back up to my agenda. Kyle, you're on, man.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kyle Rose, and I'll be talking about some updates we've made to the captive portal architecture since Singapore. Next slide, please. All right, so as Martin nicely pointed out, I missed the deadline to upload. However, I have uploaded it since then. So if you've managed to look at it in the last few days, that's great. Otherwise, if you managed to look at the editor's copy I mentioned on the mailing list, that's also great. But it is what it is. All right, so what's changed? Well, two major things. That's pretty much all I changed. First, I tried to make the security section relating to the APIs a little stronger. And then I added a fairly large section, which attempted to summarize the majority of the discussion we had in Singapore about user equipment identity. And then finally, on list and in GitHub, we've been discussing quite a few issues related to the architecture, and I'll also go over these during the presentation here. Next slide. All right, so security of the API. I kept this pretty short. I basically mentioned that the privacy and integrity of the information exchange with the API is a must. We must use TLS. I didn't specify HTTPS, so because I wasn't sure we wanted to get into HTTP versus other applications, but I left it at that. That's pretty much it. So one thing I want to ask is this enough, or do I need to get into a bit more detail in the typoed architecture there? It's pretty vague, but maybe it's better for the API to be precise about exactly how the security is going to happen. And from reading it and from what Tommy was saying, it sounds like we're really thinking about it in the API as well. Does anyone have any thoughts on that? I'll take that as no. Next slide. All right, so this is something that's been bothering us for a bit, user equipment identity. Basically, when all the devices are interacting in the architecture, how do they agree on the identity of the equipment that's trying to traverse the network? In particular, we have two distinct components, the API server and the enforcement device, that need to act on the identity. The user equipment device needs to decide whether or not the packet needs to be allowed through based on where the packet came from, who it belongs to essentially. And the API server needs to be able to tell the equipment whether or not it is blocked, as well as interact with the user equipment to tell it to allow the packets through, sorry, the enforcement device. So how do we do that? Well, we discussed it, and I tried to capture some of the thoughts we had. In particular, I think from the mailing list and from those discussions that there's some requirements on the identity that need to be met in order for this to work. And so I tried to capture those. In particular, the identifier should be unique, so only one person or equipment, it's a little vague there, but basically one thing that's allowed for the device at a time can have the identifier. Otherwise, things might not work. should be hard to spoof. So you don't want people pretending to be somebody else, regardless of whether or not they're on the network. Obviously, the API needs to be able to infer the information or get the information from its communications. Likewise, the enforcement device needs to be able to infer it and get it. And I didn't mention it here, I might have actually forgot to mention it in the architecture, but they also need to agree on the identity. So the API can think the identity is a source IP, and the enforcement device can think it's the MAC address, and that's not very useful, unless they have some way of correlating the two together. So I should make that, if I haven't, I need to make that clear. So it's probably an issue with the document right now. Next slide, please. So beyond actually specifying what I think, or what we should think the identity should, what properties identity should have, I talked about, I didn't want to get into suggesting a specific identity because I think that different deployments, different networks are going to have different requirements, and those requirements might preclude you from using a particular identity over another. And so I gave some recommendations on how to actually evaluate the identity or a potential identity against another so that you can choose the best possible one. And then I gave two examples. I gave the physical interface to which the device is attached as a possible identity, and I have the IP address of the device as another possible identity. And then I evaluated them. So actually, I want to talk about these two examples here because I had a bunch of discussions with people this week, and I also worked on this during the hackathon a bit. I'll start with the IP address. So with the IP address, it's nice because it should uniquely identify the user equipment, or maybe, if you're behind a NAT or something, it's that NAT, but I mean, that's okay. But it's pretty easy to spoof. So what you need some way of the network enforcing that only one user has an IP address at a time. And not only that, but if the ownership of the IP address changes, maybe notifying the enforcement device and the API server that that has changed so they can invalidate the records. So I played around with that at the hackathon. And what I ended up actually doing was splitting the enforcement into two. You had the section of the enforcement on link with the user equipment, and then you had upstream the enforcement device, the main enforcement device was doing the couch portal. And that made me think that maybe in the architecture, we should be splitting enforcement into two logical components. A component that is responsible for ensuring the uniqueness, validity, etc., of the identifier on link, and then the actual enforcement device is responsible for deciding whether or not to allow the packet outside to the external network. And I played around with the hackathon, it worked pretty well, what I did. So it's something worth considering. I'll probably propose it on the mailing list to see how people feel about it, but if anyone has thoughts, please talk about it now. As for the physical interface, I was talking to Pierre about this, and we were saying, well, if you can communicate the physical interface to which the device is attached all the way up to the user equipment, the enforcement device, the enforcement device doesn't actually have to be on link. It's possible that you use a tunnel to make it pseudo on link, or maybe you tag the packet somehow with maybe SRv6 or something to indicate the origin of the packet in the network. There's a bunch of options there, and maybe we should explore them a bit more. Maybe not in this draft, maybe in another draft. But I would like to think more about the physical interface case because it could simplify things in a lot of ways.
Pierre, I just wanted to mention one aspect that you didn't mention is that the user equipment identifier doesn't need to be known by the device itself. It's something that is decided by the network, and we just need that to be a thing that the IP or the wireless controller or the first switch or the first router is able to know. And as you mentioned, when it receives a packet, tag somehow the packet with that ID, and that ID is going to go to the enforcement point, and then the policy can be applied. So it just needs to be something that is secure, but the device doesn't need to know it.
And my main concerns with that one were whether or not it constrained the location of the API server somehow. and what that would mean to the overall solution.
This was the essence of the discussion we had in Singapore.
Yeah.
And we went through this at great length. And I think Pierre's capturing most of what we concluded, though. Are you suggesting that we might want to not foreclose on that possibility?
I would like to think about it. I don't know, like my personal preference is to allow as many solutions as possible, but it's not really what we want to do here. So I guess, I'm somewhat, does the working group want to recommend a specific identifier, or do we want to talk about classes of identifiers and what properties they need to have? Because what I've done right now is I've suggested properties, but no specific identifiers.
Yeah. You've just hit all of the red buttons all over Nick, and he's twitching right now. So we'll let Nick say what he has to say, and then we'll.
Do you want to do it later? Or? Okay.
Go ahead.
Nick Doty, UC Berkeley. So I think capabilities rather than specific identifiers is a best practice. And in particular, I'm concerned that so far the properties that are described in there are how hard the identifier needs to be. But we might also want to specify how soft the identifier should be. That I'm particularly concerned when we're recommending physical interface and trying to send up physical identifiers as high as we can, that they might leak essentially. So I think there are substantial privacy concerns to saying, oh, we need this really hard permanent identifier and we should share it with all these other parties. So I think we should talk about properties, and I think we should specifically talk about this privacy property and trying to limit who we're disclosing these permanent identifiers to.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Now, would you prefer that? Does that mean that we can't use a physical interface, or does it limit the scope over which we can communicate that information without anonymizing it somehow?
Yeah, I mean that's interesting. You could go different directions with that. I mean, if we actually think people will follow a fairly specific recommendation, then maybe we should be specifically providing this is how you insulate some identifier, so that it's different when users connect to different portals, and so that it doesn't leak to higher layers, that sort of thing. I don't know if people are going to follow that specific algorithm for this, but if we think so, then we could explicitly try to recommend that.
All right, no, I think that's the privacy of that information is certainly important. I would like to.
So for background for Nick, the part of the point of this is how does this particular network think of this particular user equipment? And yes, we don't want that identifier escaping that network. And part of that, I think, is making sure that the user equipment doesn't actually know how it's being identified. So then it's not propagating that identifier through the network indirectly. So, for instance, if you had a situation where you went from that portal and the URI of that portal contained the identifier, then you're suddenly spraying referrer headers all over the internet as a result of those interactions. So you have to be relatively careful about that sort of thing. But IP address is really something you just can't avoid having sprayed all over the internet in the internet as we know it. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a very good
I did
point.
rule it out. Yes, that is a problem.
No, I was about to say that it's this discussion shows that the user equipment identity and IP addresses have completely different properties. And an equipment is going to use multiple addresses and privacy addresses, so the address is going to change all the time.
Right.
To answer your question, whether this should, whether the architecture or even the working group should specify a specific type of identifier, I think not, because this is really specific to the type of link the device is attached to. So I think this could be many different things, and even for one given captive portal, if that portal is providing a service to Wi-Fi link and wired link, it might need to use different identifiers.
But those are my thoughts as well, and I'm glad everyone agrees.
I think part of the danger of this leaking is that I absolutely support we should provide variation, and there's going to be variation, so we should accept it. But I'm starting to see in cafes, oh, you have to log in on Facebook and post it. So there are definitely options that are on the internet through a particular social network before So I'm concerned that like we would need to specify kind of directly what the limits on an identifier is, because just saying, oh, well, the enforcement point will take care of it, or the like that enforcement point like might already be too late at that point, you know?
Yep.
Fair enough.
Sometimes.
Next slide. Oh, you have a.
Oh, look at that.
All right,
Done.
We out of time?
Yep, carry on. I think
Okay.
we're done the first three.
Yeah, I just, a few more slides here. I'm just going over the open issues that we have. So we've discussed a few, we've discussed a few on here, and we've discussed a few elsewhere. So we can probably just go through the next few slides. Next slide. Something that was raised in the GitHub repo, and I can't remember why we decided to do it, but there's a question: does the PUD give the state of your captivity, the API, or both? I think it's just giving the API, but I want to, no one's discussed this on the working group at all, and I just want to see what people think.
Jeffrey Sir has an author of the PPT draft again. I don't think it cannot, I think it cannot give the state. It cannot give the state. It's not designed for that purpose to give something. It's not designed to give something that depends on the user. It's not designed to give something that is private. And it's not designed to give something that changes all the time.
Okay.
So it can give the API, that's really clear, but not the state.
So I think we should probably then just, that devic can be closed. There's the answer. It's doing this. Done. Oh. Oh, yeah, it's true. Tommy's not there. I can ask Tommy after and see how it goes. Yeah.
Where did Tommy go? We just hit one of his.
Well, you can just pretend to be him then.
No. We'll check with Tommy whether he has an objection to that. But I've recorded the 3 points that you made, that it's not very good at dynamic things, it's not very good at per user things, and it's not very good at confidentiality. So maybe it's not exactly the thing we're looking for. So we'll see what Tommy has to say about that separately.
All right. This is my last slide, and it's probably going to be contentious. But the question here is, what do we do with ICMP? Right? So the current draft that has expired, I think. I can't remember if David refreshed it or not. Either way, there's a draft right now. It's quite complex. It describes sort of two different versions of ICMP. One which is intended to notify you that there's a problem, and another one that's intended to notify you that there might be a problem. For example, like, you're being shaped, or there's some QoS issues, things like that, and you might want to visit the captive portal to upgrade your service. So we have something we can do here. Do we go with ICMP at all? And if we do, which of the two mechanisms do we use? The simple one or the more complex one, where you have a lot more flexibility in how you signal the user equipment? Or do we just say, nope, ICMP is out, at least for now? I would personally prefer to have some ICMP mechanism, because I think it is nice for cases like where you're not necessarily denying it's not an all or nothing type of captive portal, but it's a captive portal used to notify the user of issues.
Darshik Thakur, so can we, sort of my question was, can we even get rid of ICMP completely? Without that, then how would, if, let's say the time expired or something happened, right?
Well, the time expired, you know the time. Or so presumably you know the time.
Yeah, but I think, but the user's browsing, right? And then suddenly it's not working, right? So
I think it requires that the user pull the API.
Oh, okay, yeah, so okay.
And the question is, do we want that? Is that better?
At least, okay, my suggestion would be at least have an ICMP enough to say, at least send the unreachable, right? So that the device can react and go and check the API.
Here we go.
No. Warren Kumari, so I'll happily admit that I stopped following the discussion a while back. But was the whole "how do you stop this being spoofed" thing ever settled? Which to me
we had some discussions about it. So one discussion was one point made earlier was maybe just the entropy contained in the transport headers is enough, and I think there was some objection to that. Another one was the HMAC that we're talking about passing around in the API. Can we use that as a token?
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay, now I remember
So
that.
we have a design for that. We have a design that could be deployed in that case.
You know, it'd be really nice if I knew that I was going to be locked down before I get locked down, you know? Because that's like, to me, the only, literally the thing that's the most important that we can't do today and that we need a way to do is like to log in and re-up your time before it expires. It's like, you know, because everything else, you know, 302s work, right? Like stupid plain text 302s work for everything else, but not for this. And so I don't think the ICMP message is particularly useful. I think it's basically security-wise, it's very difficult. But I think most importantly, like, you know, we want something to tell us in advance. And I think if we're going to have an API anyway, then this is kind of useless. But. Well, one thing it helps you with is where you are for some reason there is a problem in the network, and you or the captive portal, and maybe you hate this even more. The captive portal has decided that you are not allowed to go here right now because it's not in the walled garden.
That's fine. Destination unreachable. That's what that's for.
Yeah.
Okay, so
TCP reset, right? I mean, if it doesn't want to go
okay,
anywhere.
you say destination unreachable, and what's the response of the system?
It doesn't work.
And the user's like, well, my thing's not working. I'm going to phone up a provider.
Yeah, bad network operator. I'm going to complain. That's exactly how it works.
But you know, it would be much nicer. If users hate complaining. They would much rather say, "Hey, go to your portal page."
We're not going to get rid of, obviously, ICMP altogether. There are going to be times when a destination is unreachable, okay? And so you're going to get a destination unreachable, and you need to know what to do. And what you do when you get a destination unreachable is you stop trying to go to it, okay? And if you do something else with a destination unreachable, you're going to start screwing up what we don't want to screw up what basic networking stuff is already for. If you get a redirect, you redirect, okay? Because we don't want to play with those. Now, the question is whether to create a new ICMP message, right?
Well, I think I'm not an ICMP expert, but the original suggestion was an extension to the ICP destination unreachable. So it's not exactly the same as an unreachable.
Well, you have to expect that 99.9% of nodes for a long time are not going to implement this, and they're going to get a destination unreachable with a code they don't understand. And before you do anything at all, you need to understand what they do at that point and whether that is what you wanted them to be doing. And I'm guessing probably not, but we could talk about that. What you want them to do, you're going to send them a destination unreachable. What you want them to do is actually not to think the routing system can't get where they're going, but to realize that their timing has expired. Right?
Yeah, well,
destination unreachables are cached at the IP level, and what you're really wanting is for the nodes that are out there right now, the user needs to figure out that his time has expired and go back into a web browser and hook back up. And I'm not sure that sending you a destination unreachable is going to.
Well, the idea is that the captive portal destination unreachable would indicate to the user equipment that there's a problem with the captive portal, and would prompt them to go to the API.
In new implementations.
Yes.
In the 99% of nodes who've never read this document, right, the implementers have never read this document, or they're already out there, what are they going to do? Right? They're going to cache that destination is unreachable. When I try to go into the web browser to get to it to renegotiate, am I going to be able to get to it? I mean, I don't know. What destination are you going to tell it is unreachable as part of the problem? Anything it happened to be going to at the time?
I've struggled with that one as well. Like if you're talking about the case where it's not all or nothing, it's, which one is bad? How does the user know which one is bad? And one thing is that I thought maybe the enforcement device could signal the API service somehow, but maybe there's some awful races there. I'm not. It does seem a little complicated.
So Warren Kamari, I have some sort of background on this for some of Margaret's questions. So I mean, it could be that if you only have access to certain sets of things because you're in a walled garden, you would try and reach outside the walled garden, and you would get back a normal ICMP reachable, which a normal device would treat as unreachable. However, it would also have an extension so that it could provide information to the user, in their web browser or whatever, instead of just being like, you can't get there. You can't get there because something captive portal, handwave. I'm not actually supporting this, I'm just, the background. And then there was also some other discussion on you could use a different ICMP type just as a signal to, you should probably come back soon because your time is about to expire, not your time has already expired. So more of just a sort of notify type mechanism. Just some background. Yeah, yeah, a new one as well. So yeah, annotate ICMP to be, unreachable to be unreachable because captive portal and we don't like whatever.
Mariko Kobayashi from Keio University and the Y project. And I have a question for Kyle. I'm sorry if I missed your what you explained before, but what is your original idea and motivation for this second one, more complex mechanisms? And did you have any original use case?
That's what Warren was just referring to. So the case where
same thing.
Yeah, the user equipment can tell you, for example, that your time is about to expire, or that you are being shaped because you haven't purchased the expensive service.
Thank you.
So not hearing a lot from people. I'd like to know whether or not we continue to pursue this. I'm not hearing a huge amount of enthusiasm for it, though.
I think I may be the only person who likes it.
Yeah. And if that's the case, then maybe we're into the, well, how do we make sure that we can do this as an extension if we decide to change our minds later on and just proceed without it for the time being mode? Is that right? Dasha?
Yeah, just a quick, just one question. So if we, let's say, decide not to do ICMP, right? We still need some mechanism, right? And what would it be? I mean, do we have any other options to actually consider?
Well, like Lorenzo said, if the network stops working, well, it stops working, and you treat it like a network that has stopped working.
And so there's never a case of, so we don't solve the problem of being able to tell that your time is about to expire or anything like that.
You should know that your time's about to expire.
Just from the, okay, so we're just expecting the
I would say maybe we change the workflow in the architecture a little bit to support these use cases. So suggest that the API is consulted with some frequency, things like this.
Yeah, okay. So I mean, if you get the destination unreachable, it would be logical to go and use the API to see okay, how much time I have left. Oh, 0. Oh shit, I need to do something. My clock was wrong. I was assuming I had 1 minute, but not anymore.
Yeah. So there is an administratively disabled option in.
Yes, there's 3 of them subtypes. There's like communication prohibited by administrative reason for network and host, and then there's just general communication prohibited by administrative reasons.
And so,
and I mean, there is several of those, 7 or 8 of those in total, and I think most of the hosts, destination unreachable, whatever subcode, they don't care. They
treat it all the same way.
Yep. If they don't understand, they treat it the same way.
Yeah, maybe we can ask Tommy what he does, but. That is an option.
I was just thinking about other use cases where the user is trying to go outside of a walled garden because their time has expired or for some other reason it doesn't work, and we don't want the captive portal trying to impersonate the page, and so it would be nice to contact them. So it was being discussed over the weekend that there are some HTTP 451 cases where someone else along the way is interfering, but and some people might say, oh well, perfect, you can use HTTP 451, except that means you have to impersonate the end server, and obviously we don't want to tell people to do that. So I'm just curious and maybe it is, I need to look more at ICMP, but if we can have a code saying you can't get to this.
So we should talk about this. We've already had this discussion, okay. So we should talk about this afterwards.
Great. Yep. Thanks.
Just a quick comment. Currently, on the considering the network deployment, so some ISP is just blocking the ICMP and entire ICMP packet. So I don't think that we have another extension to ICMP. I think it's a little bit hard to deploy because we have API server, the API server and the new client, but the middle network is old network. In this case, if even the end-to-end has a new extension, but middle switches or those things may block the packets.
I guess there's a question of how much control, how far away is the enforcement device. If whoever's operating the captive portal has full control of the entire network and it's not too complex for them to change it to support this, sure. But that's a good point. I mean, having to enable either a specific ICMP message or allow all ICMP message or something might be cumbersome to some operators. On the other hand, I heard people complaining about not allowing ICMP through the other day because of IP fragmentation and path MTU discovery and all that fun stuff. So maybe those operators are bad people. But,
Pierre, I agree that this new message could be hard to operate. And also a point I wanted to make, as Margaret mentioned, this, if it exists, would be a new thing that would be implemented by hosts alongside the API. So I think for now the answer is that we shouldn't do that and try to solve the issues we find using the API. And if we ever fail to address all the problems with the API, then we can ask ourselves, do we need a new type or destination unreachable is enough?
So going, maybe, forward thinking, one possibility to keep the architecture open to this is to mention that there may be some on-path signaling that doesn't interfere with the actual HTTPS transactions, real customer traffic at an inappropriate layer, and just leave it at that. In the future, we could add more, but.
Yeah, as far as the architecture document is concerned, yes.
I think that if you try to route to somewhere you can't get, you are going to likely get it, well, if it comes all the way back to you, an ICMP destination unreachable. And that doesn't tell you that much. The assumption that we're going to figure out we're in a walled garden from that, it just doesn't make sense. It could be that a router's down, we have a temporary routing issue. I think that there's good ways to find out you're in a walled garden. Like we could add to this, or we could have you use PVDs and you get you're in a walled garden. You could even get what address ranges you can reach through this walled garden, or some other information that tells you when to use this walled garden and when to use another interface if you have one. And that, like, overloading ICMP unreachable is not really going to tell you you're in a walled garden, right? It's having stuff happen where you try to go to a website when you get a destination unreachable just seems wrong to me. I just, like, because there's a lot of times when you get a destination unreachable and that's not what you want to do. And so I'm concerned about that. And yes, you could say, well, only if you get a destination unreachable with this option in it, and the HMAC matches this and all that, but I don't know, you're kind of taking ICMP out of what it's supposed to do at that point, because you're using it as a signaling protocol. And if you want a signaling protocol in this API, add one.
Tommy Polly. Having thought about it, I kind of do like the ICMP model for at least letting you know that something has closed on you, because at least what we have right now, the API can indicate to you, if you grab it once, oh, here's your expected lifetime in time, here's your expected lifetime in bytes. The UE estimating the number of bytes it is sent is not necessarily deterministic. It's going to be wrong, right? Like, so, what happens if I think I have more lifetime left on my portal? Unless we're mandating that you have a long-lived push connection to your API server at all times, which sounds really fraught. We could go that direction if we wanted to. Essentially, what happens? Like, we should recommend some behavior when the captive portal closes. Is it just redirecting us like it is today? Because I'd like to get away from that. And so some rejects, maybe it's not ICMP, maybe it is your captive HTTP error or something else, but that only works for HTTP. So there are some benefits to ICMP here, and just for that model, not signaling you're in a walled garden now, you're captive now, but you already knew you were captive and it closed.
That raises something in my mind that David Bird had mentioned a while back. I think it was either on the mailing list or personally, but the enforcement device is ultimately the source of truth for whether or not a packet can make it to the network. And if something happens to it, maybe it crashed, maybe it rebooted, maybe someone pulled the cable or something, things are bad, and the API might not know. That raises a whole other series of concerns.
My objection is not to having a signaling protocol. It is not to using an ICMP message for the signaling protocol. It's to overloading ICMP unreachable as the signaling method. A different ICMP message might be the right way.
Okay, so maybe the question is, the first question we should ask is, does Captive Portal require a signaling protocol? the next. At what layer does a signaling protocol exist? And maybe we didn't spend enough time thinking about it abstractly like that.
Right.
I would
Ask
argue,
those questions.
sorry. Yeah, I would argue that we do require not necessarily a signaling protocol, but some specified behavior for what happens when your portal is closed. What happens to your traffic? You could say there is no signaling portal and you're just left out in the dark and, oh, I just have a black hole. But that's not ideal.
I don't think it actually is changing the definition of destination unreachable if it say that, okay, your captive portal decided to block you now. It is destination unreachable. Yes, we should probably add a new subcode there. Like we have already multiple of those. We have 15, which is 5 in the original RFC, and then we have 5 more and 5 more. We could add a new one. As I said, most of those are going to be processed by the client exactly the same way that they do everything else except fragmentation needed, which is the one special case that is also there. But I mean, it's not overloading that because we are still blocking the device, and the source address of that ICMP is going to be the enforcement device. So you actually know a little bit where it is, but it doesn't have to know it. You just know that something is blocking your connections, and you are supposed to stop doing what you are trying to do. And then whatever you do to recover from that, if you are using IPsec and mobile, you just switch to different IP address because that one is clearly broken.
Maybe I'm misunderstanding something, but I thought I heard we use destination unreachables and we add a field to them to contain the HVAC that gets checked to determine whether or not to do certain things, which is defining destination unreachable differently. And you also, you just have to make sure there are many uses of destination unreachable. For instance, a correspondent node, if it receives persistent destination unreachables, will assume that the mobile node might have moved. It will go back to the home node and ask it where it is. Is that going to, are we going to cause any problems for that? I don't know. I haven't read that spec in a long time. Okay, but there's a lot that relies on destination unreachable, and maybe we'd always be sending one now anyway, because if the portal's closed, do we, like in the real world right now, do captive portals send the destination unreachable? And, and that's okay because your destination is unreachable. But if you start talking about, well, we're going to put extra fields in it, and you should do X if the HMAC is right and Y if the HMAC is wrong, that's really redefining something that's an IP level message.
Fair enough. So I think your argument, your points about the fact that the enforcement point and the API server might be out of sync is very good. So what about something that would basically tell the host something went wrong, you should probably check out the API server now, instead of doing something that is going to mess really hard with the IP layer? Just do something, just a message that tells you should know you're captive, and you should check the API server to understand why this packet was dropped.
I think that was the point of the more complex ICMP mechanism I was talking about. And maybe we do that, we propose the captive portal ICMP version or option and leave it simple like that for now.
Okay, I don't think you want to do. As I said, I want to keep the ICMP as it is now. Adding a new subtype there is different. Adding a new fields there for HMAC is completely out of the question. I think that's and using the ICMP as a hint to say that, okay, now there's something wrong with the network. I need to do something. For example, I said in IPsec in mobile, if we get an ICMP on host unreachable, we started, okay, that's probably faked, or it might be like that. Let's try with the right level packet and see if the other one is alive. Oh, he's alive, that was fake. Oh, I'm not getting response back. Okay, I probably should try some other route. Oh, I found this route, it works. So the ICMP is always a hint there. And here we can do the same thing. We can use the ICMP on host destination unreachable because of the communication prohibited by administrative reasons. That's a hint telling that, okay, it might be from the captive portal telling me something. Okay, I should probably ask from the captive portal using the API what's going on, and that's it's just a hint. And there is no point of really trying to authenticate it. That's going to be completely very difficult. And even if it authenticates, it's going to get all kind of replay issues and that kind of issues. So don't even try that.
So supposing we don't do an HMAC, so we don't have any security, so to speak, in it. Maybe that's where the API becomes hidden away from the user.
If
the
you
device automatically queries the API and says, "Hey, what's my state?"
Yes, yes.
And then if it is bad, then it pops up the browser.
And if you want to do authentication, just use TCP, HMAC, or for example, IPsec or AH or something other protocol we already have. Don't invent a new one. But those are too complicated. Don't do that.
All right. So I want to get people to concentrate on the question of whether we have a signal here rather than talk about designing solutions. And I know that's appealing to stand at the microphone and spitball new ideas, but the question of whether we want a signal or not cuts away a lot of things very simply if we can decide not. And if we decide that we need one, obviously we can then talk about taking on that extra work, but it could be very easy for us if we make a decision in one particular direction. So Tommy, keep that in mind.
All right. Tommy, Polly. So I appreciate the comments, Tiro. I think if we go in the direction of saying, we don't need an explicit signal for this, which is attractive, so I'll say I can vote in that direction. I just want to say also, like in the architecture API, we should clearly specify that if you do use this as a hint, if something goes wrong as a hint, make sure that that is somehow rate limited, that you're not turning this into an attack on the API server, So that becomes a security consideration. But beyond that, I think you can totally live without having that explicit signaling. We may also want to mention like, oh, you shouldn't do these other types of signaling or redirects that are no longer preferred.
I think we do need some sort of signal that tells us to look back at the API. I think it might be sufficient to say that captive portals that implement this must send an ICMP unreachable to the administrative one or whichever one of the current codes is the closest. And that clients, when receiving an ICMP unreachable and they know they're captive, should check. And you can say, well, this could turn into an attack, but since the check is a single message and an ICMP unreachable is a single message and we don't accept broadcast ICMP messages, you can't do a multiplicative attack here. So you could slam, if you're sitting there and you can send ICMP messages, you also could just access the API over and over again. Like, I don't think you're opening up an attack they couldn't already make. Right, and if it's not your packet, if you don't have that port open, you won't have anybody to send the ICMP message up to who would do anything. So you'd have to snoop on the traffic, craft messages. You do better to just slam the portal yourself.
And as Tommy says, I think that you can also put in rate limiting.
You could, but you could. I don't know. I don't know if you need to, but you could.
The 10 a second. 10 a second is probably enough to do your job.
Right. So I've criticized the ICMP proposal bitterly, long and hard, but I'm not going to talk about solutions. What I am going to say is we should not have something that's easy to spoof unless it's just a hint, right? Point one, right? Otherwise, even when you have a hint, two people ago, forget who it was, you have an amplification, you have a DOS attack against the API server. It's not multiplicative, so maybe it's not too bad, but like something that's not authenticated like ICMP has this problem. It is, I think, a spectacular failure if we standardize a solution that only works when stuff is broken, because I don't want that. I want something that can tell me before it's going to be broken. Now, if we say that the API can't tell us what time it is, or we can't agree on what time it is, or we can't agree on how many bytes we've passed, then okay, then maybe we need a signal. It would be nice if we didn't, but as long as the signal is really just a hint, because I don't see how an unsolicited message like this can be made secure in any way, right? So it really just has to be a hint. So yes, it has to be a hint. Would be nice if it showed up before it's a problem, and let's not try to make it secure because it will never be secure. Whatever, I don't know.
Yeah, Warren Kumar, I think I was going to say something similar. I think we've been talking about destination and reachable and stuff, I think much better would be something else, like a, by the way, your time is almost up, you should come and talk to me. Because, yeah, or, yeah, just come talk to me, yeah, whatever. Yeah. I mean, no, but unreachable will trigger certain behavior in the stack usually, like don't send packets there. I'm thinking like echo reply with no echo response.
Adam Roach, again, as an individual. I just wanted to throw in one real quick thing when talking about this not being usable for an attack. It is multiplicative in a way, because a single ICP packet is going to cause sin, ac, fin. So it's a 5x, right? You do need to have some sort of throttle on here. I just want to make sure that wasn't lost in the conversation.
Adam, you're going to get one sin multiple times maybe, but you're going to get sins.
No, because you're hitting the API, right? It's going to be an open port.
Well, if the API doesn't necessarily have to respond to you.
Yes, it does.
The client will try to talk to the API. The client will send sin, but the API has a choice of how fast it can respond to those.
Sure.
But anyway.
I'm hoping to use like normal web servers for these things.
Sure.
I stand corrected, it's multiplicative, but it's not exponential. There's nothing about using ICMP unreachable and explaining how we use it and what we do that stops us from having another signaling protocol. All right, that stops us from having the things are running out signal, which could or could not be an ICMP signal, but is not an ICMP unreachable. An ICMP unreachable says, stop trying to come this way now.
All right, so next steps here. It sounds like people aren't happy with the existing proposed ICMP solutions. Sounds like people want some sort of signal, and probably that is just a hint. So is it worth taking to the list, a poll for suggestions, or is that bike shedding and I should just propose something?
So what I'm going to suggest is if anyone wants to actually do the work to define a new signal, that they make a proposal. And until such time as we have that proposal, we assume that we don't have that proposal. I didn't hear it was as strong an interest in having the signal as would demand that we actually do something right away. I heard that there were, Tommy couldn't live without it. Lorenzo probably doesn't want it at all.
But if we live without it, we still need to specify behavior on blocking.
Right. Well, suggestions only, I think.
Maybe that all client vendors can't live without it.
No, they can. They'd be quite happy to, well, maybe not entirely happy, but would live without one. No. If they can't live without it, they're going to be doing some work, and I don't think either of them are looking to sign up for more work.
Because I think from a procedural perspective, right, if somebody starts doing work, there's going to be screams of agony from the people who have spent a lot of time working on this. So we would probably need at least some form of requirements before we say, okay, well, we don't want to do this. We want to build something new because we don't like your standard, right? So that I just wanted to say that. I mean, so asking for work may not be, I don't know.
Well, maybe that rather than just specifying ICMP, I need to talk about the requirements on the signaling protocol and the architecture.
I mean, shouldn't be too hard. It's a paragraph of text, right? I mean, I can try and put 3 bullet points into an email, and then maybe Tommy has another 2 bullet points, and we get.
I'm willing to work with you guys on it.
Because, like I said, it needs to be, probably hard to secure. Therefore, most likely needs to be a hint, and would be nice if it showed up in advance. That's it.
So Warren Kumari, hopefully my final comment. So whatever we build, like an API, whatever that tells people how long they've got, is going to be so much better than what we've got now that maybe we should solve that bit first, and then we can always revisit this later and add more sexiness.
Thank you for restating what I was trying to say earlier. So I actually think that it would be good if Lorenzo, you could produce those requirements. It would be, because I think that sets the bar for any implementation. And what we will do, to Warren's point, I think, and I'll have to talk to Eric about this one, is we will assume that we don't have one until we have one. And at the point that someone is interested enough to invest the effort in describing this signaling protocol, something that meets Lorenzo's requirements, then we'll talk about adopting it at that point. I don't think there's any burning desire to have that at the moment, but nor is there any strong opposition to someone doing that work, should someone be willing to invest the effort. So I think that might be a way forward. Thank you, Kyle.
All right.
And thank you, everyone, for being so constructive. I have nothing more here, but Darshak has something to share. We have a little bit of time. It's less time than you asked for, but right, you tell us all what it is, and we'll go from there.
So, hello. So I'm Darshak Thakur. I work for Cable Labs, and this is, I think, this presentation is just kind of just throw out an idea right now and kind of ask the work group kind of question. Right, it is. There's a lot of details not in here, and that I may not be able to even talk about it right now. But in general, so next slide. So here's kind of the problem, right? So we have seen right now public Wi-Fi hotspots, and public hotspots are usually open, right? And if you have, WPA 2% or whatever, some shared passphrase, and if everybody knows it, then you kind of don't have too much security. Open don't have any security at all. There's already a push going on towards trying to make this better, right? I mean, if you see the WPA3 announcement, there's some things happening there. And then the only real solution is like something like Passpoint and Hotspot to the Door, which are pretty complicated for most deployments, right? So I think there's an increasing desire in general to come up with a solution that actually doesn't require, having a network administrator and things like that, but like mom and pop shops and people can actually just deploy something that is relatively secure, right, and not just completely open. So that's kind of the problem. So next slide. And so here's a question. I'm just working with a few other people, and the question that we're asking here is there's some discussions going on around where we're thinking about coming up with a solution where we may be able to leverage captive portal APIs to provide a mechanism by which a UE device or a client device that connects to sort of a untrusted or open network might be able to actually authenticate or connect or figure out that this is actually a right network. So in the sense that if you have right now, it's easy to do a man-in-the-middle attack, right? If you have an open network, you probably don't even need to do that. You can just move. But even if you have an kind of unauthenticated encrypted connection, which is one of the things that a feature called OWE provides, right? It's still open to active man-in-the-middle attacks. So this is just kind of throwing out in the air right now to see, would the working group here, right, be open to discussing or having something added to the API or something in a way where even if a device connects to kind of sort of an untrusted network, right, at least it can then somehow interact with the captive portal and do a kind of a connect but trust later kind of, or verify later kind of mechanism. And there's still a lot of details to be figured out, right? But the idea, it would certainly require something on the side of the API to actually help with that part. So next slide, yes. And this is kind of just talking about all the things that are probably already being done in order to solve this thing, right? I think other organizations, Wi-Fi Alliance specifically, WBA, are already working on trying to solve this problem. So that's where the problem is going to be solved. The question to this working group is that if, as part of that, there's something where we can leverage the captive portal API to actually make a better solution, right? Would the working group be open towards entertaining that and adding that to the captive portal API work, right? I mean, our charter explicitly says we don't want to worry about roaming stuff, onboarding and provisioning stuff, and things like that. But this is not about our user trying to select a network, but this is more about helping a user verified that they actually did connect to the network that they intended to connect, right? As opposed to being in an evil twin network. So anyway, next slide, I guess. So that's just my general question is, I just wanted to see if there is interest in, or this first is, does this fall somewhat within the scope of the charter? Is there any interest? And if so, maybe I can talk to the other people that I'm working with, especially in other organizations, to see if we can come up with some collaborative way to solve this.
So thanks for bringing the question here. As a chair, this is definitely not in our current charter. Whatever we produce here may be used by others to do any number of things, and that would not be our responsibility or would require explicit collaboration necessarily. But I will let the people speak to see whether or not they're interested in what they have, or whether they have ideas about what you might do.
Tommy Polly Apple. Is this of interest? I mean, to people in the room, probably yes. Yes, I think it's interesting. Is it within scope? I don't think so. I don't think this is the right place for that. I do think that the degree to which this overlaps with CAPPORT is very much kind of what we've been talking about with PVD stuff. So I think it'd be interesting to look at that as a broader, maybe like within the area where we're doing the PVD work, see how it fits in there, right? Because that is also a JSON blob that is a network identifier that we're trying to validate in a very similar way to this. We view the CAPPORT stuff as a extension for the CAPPORT interaction itself. But the relationship between CAPPORT and your network provisioning, like a PVD or DHCP arrays, seems to be very similar to the relationship between what you're talking about and that same provisioning. So it's a parallel thing, but not the same thing.
Just wanted to say the same thing. Could we have this discussion with in the context of the PVD work? I think that can be generalized not only to Captive Portal but really to PVD. And I think we need that. If you can provide tools to better authenticate the PVD ID, that would be awesome, because that's something we miss right now because we cannot trust the arrays we receive. And send is great, but not deployed.
So maybe that could be the work, right? So in terms of what we really do is completely open, right? I mean, what we decide to do. I mean, we don't want to have overlapping work, but if it's something that we can do collaboratively or in a more collaborative fashion, right? Then that's exactly what I'm looking at here.
So I think that's people here is interested in this work, but I don't think this is the scope of this working group. But and also I want to mention that I think if I understand correctly, this is kind of like HTTP upgrade for like a Wi-Fi. The Wi-Fi up for like using the unencrypted pathway and access points or captive. Hey, you may want to upgrade security. More secure. So here's the things. So if we have a discussion, like we need to collaborate with IEEE because like it's definitely makes changes to the Wi-Fi architecture because like there's no such mechanism to upgrade the connection between the access point and the client. So I think it's a good idea, but like before starting the discussion, I think we may talk with the IEEE as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a point. The idea of my question here was to, if there's interest in here, at least to kind of work about it, then the next step would be talking maybe with WFA, WBA, IEEE, whatever the relevant places are where the work is being done to actually make sure it's in sync.
I think this is great for situations where, or for networks that don't have captive portals as well. Like for example, your home network, someone comes by and drowns out the signal and makes you connect to their router. So, but that it kind of goes to demonstrate that this is beyond the scope of the captive portal working group, I think. But it's still something really needed because these attacks do happen. So it'd be great for users to do this kind of work.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Dasha.
All right. So
I think that concludes our agenda. Unless do you have anything more to add?
No, so the question was, so it seems like a lot of this is within the scope, but if there's something concrete brought in, it would be, at least we can have the
Yeah,
discussion.
so
Yeah.
speaking with, IAB hats on, if there's anything that one of these groups wants to come and talk to us about, we can do formal liaisons, we can do people coming to the working group and simply sending emails. I prefer the latter.
Yeah.
But if it comes to that, and that's the way those groups need to work, then we can accommodate that.
Yeah, and the starting would be something like have a few requirements that the site is like, okay, we need to add this to the captive portal API. It could be as simple as that, right? A couple of things.
Yeah, but
And
right
we get
now,
feedback on it.
right now I see no action for this group other than awareness, which is good. I saw that a number of people are quite interested in the work, and we'll
That's what I
follow
wanted
up
to assess.
with you
Yeah.
separately.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And that concludes our agenda. If anyone has any other items, take them to the list. Thank you. Oh, Mariko.
I have just one comment for the cloud architecture. Like I know once we quit the IoT use cases, right? I think Carl said I think we have a lot of discussion in Chicago, and like we think we thought out of scope as IoT devices. But I think it is. Like, I believe this orchestration or architecture for headless IoT devices means the automation of captive portal process without web browser. And I think we can think again as one of the use cases, like the add one section to the architecture document, or like publish some new I'm not sure, but the draft for like the architecture for IoT device, like headless devices, and if there is demand, I'd like to volunteer for it.
Okay.
So just comments.
If you think you can provide text, send an email to the list with that text, or talk to Kyle, or send a pull request. Welcome those sorts of additions. Yes.
So, I didn't quite get all of that, but if we're proposing actually making it possible right now and specify exactly how headless IoT device will be able to connect to a captive portal, that will require changes to the API, because the API is only providing you a place to go to log in. It's not providing you the button to log in. Yeah. No. And so maybe we just need to make it clear in the architecture that we're not preventing this from happening, and we can start extending it in the future. And if that's what Mariko was saying, great, I agree.
Yep. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone.
So, what can we do? Do you have any idea of how that could work?
I went all right. That was good. Not perfect, but.
So do you want to take them